Okay, let's continue our discussion on the problem of evil. In the last video, I explained why I believe that the state that we are in is necessary for us to get into heaven, or heaven becomes possible for us. And that state, I believe, is related to divine hiddenness. What's optimum in our universe is the fact that God seems to be as far as possible. God is trying really hard to remove all the traces of his creation. But I didn't spend any time there to really get into details of exactly why that's the case. Why is it necessary that God be hidden from us for the heaven to become possible for us? Now, I don't have a kind of clear-cut answer to this because the whole idea is also very new for me and I'm also thinking it through. But I have a proposal that I want to discuss today. And of course, again, it is open to revisions. Things might change. But I believe if you want to get to the heart of the problem of evil, this is the way, at least it should be, based on these sort of foundations that I will be talking about today. All right, so the question is, why is it necessary for God to be hidden for us to get into heaven? Now, what I want to propose is that this hiddenness of God must be something about our intellect. Because the hiddenness that we're talking is not just about the vision that we have, like, okay, we can't see God. But the hiddenness seems to be something related to our intellect, in a sense that the hiddenness shows itself in a form of not being able to find any kind of effect, not just visually, in creation. So the world seems to be completely indifferent to the existence of God. The world is as if there is no God. And that also includes all the intellectual activities and intellectual struggles that we have, that we try to understand the world, but we just can't. Try to understand how it is that God exists in this world. Yes, we have all these different sufferings and problems, and we have problem with that. So I think there must be something related to the intellect. But on the other hand, we also have to realize that it's not only for us. We're not talking about only humans. In my vision of this kind of worldview that I have, human beings are not at the center. So we also have other animals, we also have plants, we also have inanimate objects. And all of them should fit somehow into this picture. So I don't want to focus so much on the human intellect side of things, but the answer that we should be looking for should work also for lower intelligences, such as animals and plants. So one way to get this working is by looking at the story of Adam and Eve, which I don't think it happened, but it's a nice story to demonstrate the point that I'm trying to make. My suggestion is, what if the reason that we cannot get into heaven, or the heaven is not possible for us, is the fact that for us to be in heaven, we need to be at rest. Because by definition, as I said, the heaven is that state in which we will be at rest and we will declare our existence as good, which would mean that we should be intellectually also at rest. We should be happy, in other words. Now imagine the state that Adam and Eve had in heaven, in so-called heaven, right? I think we can say that they were really not in heaven because they were not intellectually at rest. Because if they were at rest, then they would not be interested in knowing what would happen if they eat, for example, from that specific tree of knowledge or whatever. There were some things that they wanted to do, that their intellect was looking at and seeing it as a candidate for something good, but it was prevented for them to have access to it. Well, that means that your intellect is not at rest. Your intellect is not satisfied with what it has. So that's why I say that I don't think we can define the state that Adam and Eve were in as a state of bliss or in heaven, because they were not intellectually at rest. So this leads me to the suggestion that I have, is that maybe the reason that we cannot be in heaven right now is that if we were in heaven, we would not be at rest intellectually, so that would not be heaven. So heaven is not possible for us because our intellect is not ready to be at rest. Now, why would that be? Again, similar to Adam and Eve, because your intellect has not yet maybe seen everything or investigated enough. It seems that intellect has this kind of independence that it does what it wants to do. It wants to know things. And unless it comes to that point that it can rest in heaven, then it's not possible for us to get into heaven. If we, and I'm not just saying this out of blue, the reason that I got this specific thing is obviously the fact that divine hiddenness seems to be targeting the intellectual part. Could it be that the fact that God is trying to remain hidden is to give as much as space as possible to our intellect to look around, to roam freely, to try out everything, to look into everything, to basically be lost and to try out everything that it can look and realize as good and get some information out of it, to learn everything that it can learn. So when it is in heaven and sees and is united with God, it knows that it's the best thing that can happen. It's the good for it. Because if you're united with God, but the intellect might still be thinking, maybe there's something else that's good for me, that means your intellect is not at rest. It means that the intellect has not recognized God as good, as the ultimate good, as a thing that it really wants. So it wouldn't be in heaven. This scheme, I believe, is a nice proposal because it also works for other animals. It's not just for us. For other animals, it would basically mean that they also have to be at rest when they go into heaven. However, because they're intellectually inferior to human beings, as that's pretty obvious because of the observations that we have, human beings create all these magnificent intellectual works, but we don't see a dog do that. They have intellect, but that at much lower level. For them, it seems that the bar is much lower for them to basically to ascend to the fact that, hey, we're good. In heaven, we got it. We reached what we wanted to reach. So even for them, it's possible to see this, and it would basically mean that they suffer less because they're intellectually also less, less gifted. But it will also mean that they will get into heaven, more quickly because they can ascend to being in heaven more quickly. However, for human beings, it would mean the more intellect, the more intellectual activity you have, the stronger intellect you have, the more you need to search, and therefore the less possible the heaven becomes for you. So if we say, okay, we have other entities even with higher intellects than human beings, we can imagine that it would be even more difficult for them to get to the point where heaven becomes possible for them. All right, so that's I understand it's a little bit complicated, but to recap, I believe the state that we are in is made for our intellect to have this kind of space. And that's why it's optimized by God to be the place best suited for our intellects to try out, to try to understand. And that's why God is as far as possible. And we will remain in this state until heaven becomes possible for us. And heaven becomes possible for us only when our intellect is basically tired. And it says, okay, I now know everything that I want to know, and now I can rest in peace. And that's, I believe, when we will be united. That's when heaven becomes possible, and I believe when the heaven becomes possible, we are immediately in heaven, because there's no point in staying anymore in this state. Another beauty of this approach is that it also brings up a kind of justice into the system, because people, when you talk about universalism, they also worried about, they say, okay, if you're talking about this, then that means like no matter how you behave, no matter how you act, you will end up in heaven. Even Satan will end up in heaven. Even all the bad human beings, all the horrible things that they've done to humanity, they will also end up in heaven. So what's the point? Like, why? What's the difference? The way that we live here, in the end, we're going to be in heaven. Now the difference is, because if God is good, if we believe, for example, let's say that God is love, and we will be in heaven only if we intellectually rest in the fact that God is love and love is good. We see that as good. That's the only way that we will rest in heaven. But if you're someone who goes against those things, if you're someone who says, you know what, I see goodness not in love but in hate, I see it in selfishness, then that intellect obviously can never ascend to rest in heaven. Because to rest in heaven means to see love as good. But if you don't see love as good, then obviously the heaven is not possible for you. So the way that things would work out to me is that the intellects who go against God or do bad things because God is good, they will stay longer in that state of separation from God. So they will stay there longer, and they will suffer more, because again, this whole suffering that we go through is the result of not being in union with God. So it's a kind of a purgatory that we go through to not cleanse us of our sins, the way that Christianity, for example, talks about it, but cleanse our intellect, so we can realize that the good that we want is actually God. So we can rest in peace, knowing God and seeing God and being in that beatific vision. So that's the way that I approach the problem of evil. It's not very optimistic in a sense, because what it means is that we are going to be tired intellectually. We're going to be disappointed so many times. So after this life, I don't know what, but as I said, the thing that we know is that in the end, we're going to be in heaven. But what's going to happen in between is a lot of suffering. By definition, it's going to be a lot of suffering, because we're not in heaven, suffering. And it's going to be a lot of this kind of intellectual frustration. Looking around, not finding, look around, not finding, seeing something as good, going for it, oops, not it, trying out different things, not getting it. We have to get really tired intellectually to get into heaven. which would then make that rest really like a rest in peace. So yeah, that's the way that I see it. That's the way that I solve the problem of evil in my own mind. And so someone might say, okay, why is that necessary, and how is it that God cannot do anything about it? Like, can God make things to go quicker? Well, obviously can't. And I guess the reason is that, again, that freedom or independence that the intellect has. God cannot force the intellect to realize something as good, because that forcing something is exactly not good. See, so that thing cannot work as a good thing for you. We want to know things ourselves, and we see that even in our daily lives. Like, if you tell someone the answer, people don't usually like that. Everyone wants to know things on their own. They want to solve things on their own. That's why I'm making this channel, because I'm not satisfied with receiving answers from that holy book or from that specific authority. I want to understand things, and you cannot force someone to understand it, because they might do those things. They might act as if they agree with you, but intellectually you can never force them to agree that something is good for them when their intellect is telling them that is not good for them. So I guess the God is doing the best that he can do, and that is to stay away as far as it can, so our intellect has as much space as it can to roam freely looking for the good. Now, of course, there are weak points on this proposal, but for now, this is the best that I could come up with. Is this a very difficult issue? This is the main issue with our life. And again, the very fact that we are engaged in this conversation is exactly the reason why we need to be in this state. If we were not living in such a state of pain and kind of indifference, suffering, then we would not be having these kind of conversation. Our intellect would not be looking into these issues, and we would not be finding God. We would not be looking into God, and consequently finding the heaven in the end. Yeah, I guess that's about it. That's just let me know what you think. As I say, it's not a clear-cut solution. It's still work in progress. I'm still thinking through it, but this is the latest version, the thing that I have in my mind. But yeah, I will give you any updates if things change.